For many years, the name Jeffrey Epstein existed in a legal shadow, known primarily to prosecutors, journalists, and those directly affected by his actions. The origins of what would later be called the Epstein files trace back to the early 2000s, when allegations first emerged in Palm Beach, Florida. In 2005, local police began investigating claims that Epstein had sexually abused multiple underage girls at his residence. The investigation gathered significant evidence, including victim testimony and corroborating accounts, and was forwarded to state prosecutors. In 2006, a grand jury convened in Florida. Despite the volume of evidence presented by investigators, the outcome surprised many involved in the case. The grand jury returned a limited indictment, charging Epstein with a single count related to solicitation. Shortly afterward, the case shifted from state to federal consideration, where negotiations took place largely out of public view. In 2008, Epstein entered into a non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors. Under its terms, he pleaded guilty in state court to 2 prostitution-related charges, served a brief jail sentence with extensive work release privileges, and avoided federal charges altogether. The agreement was highly unusual. It included provisions that granted immunity not only to Epstein, but also to unnamed potential co-conspirators. At the time, many of the victims were not informed of the deal before it was finalized, a fact that would later become central to legal challenges. Court records, correspondence between attorneys, and internal communications related to the agreement were sealed or scattered across jurisdictions, creating a fragmented public record that obscured how the decision had been reached. For nearly a decade, the case remained largely dormant in the public sphere. Epstein continued to move within elite social circles, and the terms of the agreement limited further prosecution. It was only years later, through investigative journalism and civil litigation, that the earlier handling of the case came under renewed scrutiny. Reporters obtained emails and documents suggesting that extensive negotiations had taken place between Epstein's legal team and federal prosecutors, raising questions about discretion, influence, and accountability. In 2018 and 2019, survivors filed civil lawsuits challenging the legality of the original non-prosecution agreement, arguing that it violated their rights under federal law. These cases forced previously sealed materials back into judicial review. Judges ordered the release of certain documents, including correspondence, depositions, and filings that had remained inaccessible. Each release was incremental, often contested, and shaped by legal arguments balancing privacy, safety, and public interest. When Epstein was arrested again in 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges in New York, public attention intensified. After his death later that year, legal proceedings continued, shifting focus from criminal prosecution to civil accountability and institutional review. Courts revisited earlier decisions, and additional records were unsealed as part of those processes. What emerged over time was not a single definitive archive, but a growing body of documents collectively referred to as the Epstein files. These records did not provide simple answers. Instead, they mapped a chronology of delay, discretion, and silence. They showed how prosecutorial decisions made in the mid-2000s shaped outcomes for years afterward, and how survivors were often excluded from negotiations that directly affected them. The significance of the files lies as much in their procedural history as in their contents. They document how legal systems can obscure as much as they reveal, and how access to records can depend on persistence rather than principle. The release of these materials marked a turning point. It reframed the case not only as a story of individual criminal acts, but as a broader examination of how justice operates when power, wealth, and secrecy intersect. The Epstein files remain incomplete, contested, and evolving. Their historical value rests in what they record about institutional behavior, legal accountability, and the long path from sealed record to public understanding. History, in this sense, is not a sudden disclosure, but a slow accumulation. The Epstein files stand as evidence of that process, a reminder that transparency is often achieved not through intention, but through pressure, time, and refusal to forget. As the files became more widely known, their impact extended beyond courts and newsrooms and into the political sphere. What had once been treated as an isolated criminal case began to raise broader questions about accountability, transparency, and the role of government institutions in cases involving extraordinary wealth and influence. The debate that followed was not confined to one party or ideology. Instead, it unfolded unevenly, shaped by timing, jurisdiction, and public trust. Central to the political discussion was the handling of the original non-prosecution agreement. Lawmakers, legal scholars, and advocacy groups questioned how such an agreement could have been reached, who had approved it, and what safeguards had failed. Congressional inquiries and public statements focused less on the individual crimes already established in court and more on prosecutorial discretion and oversight. The case became a reference point in debates about whether existing legal frameworks adequately protect victims when cases are resolved through sealed agreements. The files also reignited long-standing concerns about inequality before the law. Critics argued that the procedural history documented in the records illustrated how access to elite legal representation and political connections can shape outcomes. Defenders of prosecutorial independence cautioned against retroactive politicization of legal decisions, emphasizing that agreements must be judged by the standards and evidence available at the time. This tension between accountability and institutional autonomy became a recurring theme in public discourse. As additional documents were released, political attention shifted toward transparency itself. Questions arose about why records had remained sealed for so long and under what conditions courts should unseal materials tied to cases of significant public interest. Some lawmakers called for reforms to sealing practices and greater survivor notification requirements, citing the Epstein case as an example of how opacity can undermine public confidence. Others warned that broad changes could risk privacy and due process in unrelated cases. The debate also exposed fractures in public trust toward institutions. For many observers, the files reinforced a perception that powerful individuals operate under different rules, while for others they highlighted the slow, corrective nature of legal systems that can eventually revisit flawed decisions. These opposing interpretations often existed simultaneously, shaping polarized reactions that were amplified across media and political commentary. Internationally, the case further complicated diplomatic and political narratives as names, locations, and jurisdictions crossed borders. Governments were cautious in their responses, often emphasizing that legal responsibility rests with courts rather than political bodies. Still, the presence of public officials and influential figures within the broader context of the files added pressure for clearer standards regarding disclosure and ethical boundaries. Over time, the political debate surrounding the Epstein files settled into a broader reckoning about systems rather than individuals. The conversation shifted away from singular culpability toward structural questions: how justice is negotiated, how power influences process, and how long it can take for institutional decisions to be revisited. The files became less a revelation than a reference, used in discussions about reform, oversight, and the limits of secrecy. In this way, the political response did not resolve the case so much as extend it. The Epstein files entered public life not only as legal documents, but as symbols in an ongoing debate about transparency and trust. Their legacy continues to evolve, shaped by how institutions respond not just to what was done, but to what was allowed to remain unseen for so long.